Today's project is to replace the master cylinder on my car. The problem I'm having is when driving along and I press the brakes, it takes about half of the pedal's travel before the brakes actually kick in, and it feels kind of weak and mushy. This here is where the master cylinder is located on the car. To get access to it, we're going to need to remove the strut bar as well as the air intake and the tube. I'm going to first start by removing these two 15mm nuts on the top of the strut tower. Next I'm going to remove the strut bar. To remove the airbox, I'm going to loosen up this Phillips screw here for the clamp. Then I'm going to undo these two tabs here for the airbox and disconnect the mass airflow sensor. Then I can proceed to lift the airbox out of the car. To remove this part of the air tube from the throttle body, I'm just going to pull back on this clamp. Then right up at the throttle body, I'm going to loosen this clamp here, and then I can remove the tube from the throttle body. Now that you've got clear access to the master cylinder and reservoir, to change it, we're going to need to remove these two brake line connections here, as well as one back here. And then there are two 12mm nuts, one here, as well as one on this side, that need to be removed, and then the assembly will just pop out. But before we do that, we're going to need to drain the brake fluid. Now because brake fluid is corrosive, it's essential that you make sure you use a lot of rags around the area that the brake fluid might drip on. If you look at the color of the brake fluid in there right now, you can see it's kind of dark. It should be a clearish yellow, kind of like pee. Next I'm going to use a turkey baster to suck out the old brake fluid from the master cylinder. This is what the old brake fluid looks like out of the master cylinder. Now that all the old brake fluid is out, I'm going to put a piece of saran wrap over the cap and then cover it. That'll keep any remaining fluid in the reservoir while I disconnect the brake lines. Next I'm going to use a 12mm wrench. Now it is recommended that you use a flare wrench so you don't damage the fitting, and I'm going to loosen up this brake line here. And then remove the brake line from the master cylinder. I'm going to use my 12mm wrench to loosen this brake line. And then remove this brake fitting right here. Okay, so here's what we got going on here. This first brake line here is disconnected. The second brake line here is disconnected. And the third brake line down there has been cracked loose. The next thing we need to do is remove this electrical connector for the low fluid warning switch. And then remove this 12mm nut over here, as well as a 12mm nut on this side down there. Alright, so I'm just going to wiggle my 12mm ratchet with a 6-inch extension onto the master cylinder and break this nut loose. And then carefully remove that nut. And on this side I'm going to come in with my 12mm socket extension and remove this nut and take that off there. So now I should be able to carefully remove the master cylinder and the brake booster and remove it from the vehicle. As you can see, this area around the brake booster here where it contacts the master cylinder is a little bit rusty. So here's the master cylinder removed from the vehicle. As you can see, there is a little bit of rust around this area here. That indicates that moisture has been leaking between the booster and the master cylinder. Also, you can see that there was a paper gasket here, and that should be replaced when replacing the master cylinder. Now you can see there is a little bit of fluid left in the reservoir here. So what I'm going to do is remove the cap with the seal, and you'll see I should be able to drain some of that fluid. One more thing we can do is remove this U-shaped brake line and transfer this brake line to the new master cylinder if it did not come with one. Now one more thing you can do on these master cylinders is replace the reservoir. So we just turn out this Phillips screw here, and then the reservoir just pops right off. Then you can use a flat screwdriver and wedge that in here to remove the sensor if that needs to be replaced. Now if you want to rebuild your master cylinder instead of replacing it, you need to take out the piston. To do that, I'm going to compress the piston and turn the cylinder upside down, and these two pins will pop out. Compress the piston and you'll see the two pins drop out, and now I can remove the piston from the master cylinder carefully. That's the first one, and there's a spring. Here's the second one, and here's its spring. This here's my replacement master cylinder. As you can see, it is an ACIN unit just like the original one. Next I'm going to take the original brake line and install it onto my new master cylinder, and then use my 12mm wrench to tighten that up. One thing you could do to make your bleeding job easier when you're done is to bench bleed the master cylinder. To do that, the bench bleeding kit comes with a fitting for each port here, and then a hose that you run into the master cylinder. You fill it up with brake fluid, and then use a screwdriver to pump the master cylinder a couple of times, and that'll pump all the air out from the cylinder and the fluid back into the reservoir. Before I install the new master cylinder, I'm just going to use a little brush here and remove some of the rust deposits around the brake booster. And then I'll come in with a rag and clean this up. Here you can see that I've got the brake booster all cleaned up and ready to put on the master cylinder. Now I'm going to apply a little bit of black gasket maker to the surface of the master cylinder where it butts up against the brake booster. Next I'm going to install the new master cylinder into the car. Just feed it around the brake wires and line it up on the two studs. A little touch of anti-seize on the threads is not a bad idea. Next I'm going to catch one of the 12mm nuts. Same thing on this side, I'm going to try to catch the nut. Now that everything's hand tightened, I can go in with my ratchet and tighten up the 12mm nuts, and then tighten up the 12mm nut on this side. So before I connect my brake lines, I'm going to do a quick bench bleed. I've got my cylinder connected to my booster here. What I'm going to do is go inside and depress the brake pedal and hold it. And what that'll do is push out some of the air and fluid. Now it will cause a mess, so you got to make sure there's a lot of cloths down there to collect it. And then I'm going to hold it. Then I'm going to put my fingers over this ports here and release the brake pedal. And then I'm going to depress the brake pedal again. And repeat the same thing. Now I'm going to thread in the brake lines and tighten up this brake line over here, nice and snug, and this one over here, nice and snug. Then I'm going to run the electrical wire around the back of the reservoir, clip it in, and then plug in the connector for the low brake warning light. I'm going to be using a little bit of .3 brake fluid to fill up the master cylinder reservoir. I'm going to use a funnel and fill up the reservoir to the max level. Now brake fluid is hydroscopic, so you want to make sure you keep the cap on the system for as long as possible when bleeding it. Now that the brake reservoir is filled with nice clean fluid, it's time to bleed the brakes. And if you get up under the car, this is the bleeder screw right here, so it is possible to bleed the rear brakes without removing the rear wheels. So here on the right rear caliper is the bleeder screw. I'm going to use a little bit of rust release penetrant to open that up. Next I'm going to take the box end wrench and put it over the bleeder screw, and then put my 1/8 inner diameter tube over the bleeder screw. Then I'm going to take the other end of my 1/8 tube and then connect it to my water bottle with a hole in the top. Next I'm going to have my helper here to cycle the brakes a few times, and then he's going to hold it. Then at the bleeder screw I'm going to release it for a few seconds and watch all the bubbles escape, and then close it back. And again I'm going to release the bleeder screw as my helper is holding it, and you can see the bubbles escaping, and then close it back. And then I'm going to repeat the same thing on the left rear wheel. So again with the pedal depressed, I'm going to do the same thing on the front right wheel until there's no bubbles. Finally we're going to repeat the same thing on the front left wheel until there's no air bubbles. Make sure as you're bleeding the fluid that the fluid does not run below the minimum mark. Next I'm going to replace the air intake assembly and tighten down this hose clamp. As for the airbox assembly, we have one small vacuum hose here, one larger vacuum hose down here, as well as the mass airflow plug to be plugged in over here on the airbox. I'm going to first start by sliding the airbox into the air hose, finally clip in the airbox and put in the two snaps. Next I'm going to reinstall the strut bar. Tighten these down. The last thing is to take the vehicle on a nice test drive in a safe area and test the brakes to make sure they're nice and firm and not squishy. Now if your brakes are still a little bit too mushy, what you can do is bring the vehicle up to speed here and then slam on the brakes really hard to engage the ABS. What that'll do is cycle the ABS motor to take out any air bubbles, which you can then rebleed a second time to get a firmer pedal. One more thing, the brake light is on the dashboard. That means my fluid level could be low, or the sensor in the new reservoir is not working. To take off the brake light on the dashboard, there's a little float in here that goes up and down with the brake fluid. Sometimes when you drain the fluid from the reservoir, it causes the float to get stuck at the bottom. So what you can do is push a little wire in here to encourage the float to come back up when you replenish the fluid.